welcome to the Barsaati project. Today, here we are going to explore how cultures have evolved from the yesteryears to now, from the Gen X to the Gen Z. So, if you're a Gen Xer and are embracing your inked comic books, or a Gen Z cuddled on your bed watching your Netflix, this podcast is for you. And today we will be discussing about Archies and how I got more curious and intrigued about it, and know about how it evolved in India and around the world.
So everything's Archie. Come on, let's go with the Archie Show.
Hi.
Hello.
So what does Archies mean to you, Shivangi?
So I got introduced to Archies first when Riverdale was coming out, and there was
The series.
the series,
Yeah,
the
my son
Netflix
used to watch
series.
that, yeah.
And there was a lot of noise on social media about how it's inspired from Archies, and I had no idea at that point of time what Archies was about. And I googled and I spoke to people around me, and I figured out that Archies was a comic book that my mom used to read when growing up. So I just broadly, before the series even got launched, read about the characters Archies, Betty and Veronica, and how they're from this town called Riverdale and they have these adventures. But beyond that, I didn't know much, and it just looked very retro, it looked very modern. I thought, oh, it's from that time. But when Riverdale actually came out, it was all about murder mystery and drug and abuse, and it was
dark.
very dark.
Yeah.
I don't know why it was explored like that, or why it was portrayed like that. But from what I read on Google and from what I knew about Archies from my mom, the representation was very different. So I really wanted to know that how it was for you when you were reading Archies as a comic book, because my interaction with it was from a very dark side of the world.
Oh, that's a very interesting and as you know, recently Zoya Akhtar has announced the Archies movie,
Yeah.
which is I think going to release in November on Netflix, and that also has increased my own curiosity. I was thinking, the Riverdale that I grew up reading about, how is that becoming an Indian phenomena? How are they going to have India? So it is actually stoking a lot of curiosity. And I really like your question because it gives me a reference point of the same comic characters that have been kind of shaped according to the culture that prevails today. So to you, Archies was because in your generation, when you were consuming a lot of this content, you were already used to a lot of nuanced, dark content,
Yeah.
and you wanted to explore the shadow side of yourself, which is what most content is enables you to do. But it actually is a migration from what the innocence that Archies used to represent of American culture and that too of the 40s, 50s, and the 60s.
So can we say that this Riverdale was actually a representation of how society is now?
Exactly. So this Riverdale that you're talking about, which is the more recent, darker web series, it's actually probably a representation of what is currently in the mindset of younger people. And this is what characters and assets that large publishing companies or movie makers have created. They keep changing and shaping them to current generations. But if you really want to know the history of, do you want to know the history of Archies?
Yeah. Okay. Where did it come from?
So it's a very interesting history. It all started in the 40s American
40s?
History. Yeah, because what had happened was the world was, there was a huge Great Depression in between the 20s and 30s. And America decided to go to the World War, join the World War sometime in the late 40s. And of course, there were a lot of men who signed up as soldiers, and they'd gone to Europe to fight the war against the Nazis. And they were part of the Allied forces. And the American economy was also at that point of time kind of going in transition. And there were a lot of young people whose sentiment was very low at that point in time. So one of the most interesting things is that most of the superhero comics, like Captain America or Superman, all came up at that point of time, because when society feels weak, culture creates icons, culture creates heroes, and so Superman and Captain America were two products of that era. And what the DCs and the Marvels that evolved over time that you see today. And that was really the turning point. Interestingly, Archies, which was all about this goofy young teenager, confused teenager, was also a product of the same era. In fact, if you go back and you can Google it, you can. The best part about the internet is you can almost access any kind of knowledge. So you will actually see that Archie's held out against these two superhero characters in its own way. So there was these wonderful, marvelous characters doing the impossible, and then there was this mirror representation of a young teenager who had nothing to do but fall in love with two girls at the same time and hang around with his friends and do nothing. So it was, to a large extent, it started there, and then it really moved on and evolved over the years.
Interesting. But that's what teenagers do, no? They fall in love in school. There are always these two girls that are involved. Did Archies in any way through the 40s, 50s, 60s really inspired the teenage culture that we see now?
Exactly. So there's a very interesting study on the teenage mind. And to me, this whole concept of teenagers and what Archies did to propel that concept is a very interesting one. If you remember what I just told you, when the forces went to the European continent to fight the Germans, and many of them then returned after the war got over, there was a huge surge in unemployment in the US because all the young kids whose parents had gone away to fight the war, they had grown up. They were very able-bodied men. So, kids who were 16, 17, 18, they could actually work in factories.
Yeah.
But the government had to accommodate the returning forces and had to give them jobs too. So suddenly you had a demographic conflict, which is that you had able-bodied men who had returned from the war who had to find jobs, and you had young men who were ready for jobs and who had to compete for the same positions. So what culture really did was they held this teenage years from productivity, and they therefore created this whole myth around the fact that teenagers should have fun. Teenagers are capable, but they are confused. Teenagers can actually lift heavy weights, but they can't work in factories because they are daydreaming all the time. So if you look at most of the Archie stories set in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, daydreaming is a very big thing. Doing stupid stuff is very big. The confusion is a very big theme. So in my opinion, pop culture really engineered those myths to enter the heads of people to change that behavior and to stop expecting that they'll actually get jobs. So there are some interesting papers written about this, and this whole teenage myth was propelled a lot by the Archies in the 60s.
So that teenage myth was created. It became such a huge part of our culture. Everyone just kept on enjoying their teenage years through so many years, through so many decades. But now isn't some sort of a reversal happening? Are we breaking those stereotypes? Because with the Shark Tank coming in and with the startup culture happening in India, every day over the news or over social media or on Shark Tank, you keep seeing these young teenage kids coming up and presenting their ideas who have already made like lakhs of rupees over,
Exactly.
since the inception. So
what does it prove, Shivangi? What it proves is that all these demographic labels that we've given to people, which is Gen X and Gen Z and teenagers and boomers, these are all labels. The truth is that I know a lot of young startup guys who started as early as 19 when they were still in engineering college. They've gone into pre-series valuation, etc. And I need more of them. Of course, technology and access to money has enabled a lot of these kids come out and fulfill their dreams. So you're absolutely correct. There is no such thing that young people cannot achieve. It's just that society gives you stories that condition you to believe that you are not good enough or you're not capable enough. And that's what marketing is. Marketing always tells you you're not fair enough, you're not slim enough, you're not good enough. So this sense of inadequacy that we grow up with has a lot to do with the sound that is being propagated by pop culture and marketing, and not really the fact. As you can see by the examples you yourself cited just now.
But you mentioned that this was actually launched in the US during the 40s and the 50s. How did Archies manage to end up in India and then influence the Indian culture?
Very good question. And you will also now see a lot of Archies tropes and story themes and characters being replicated in many movies that you have seen. And one of the biggest proponent of that is Karan Johar. Now, Karan Johar grew up with Archie's comics, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at most of his movies like Kuch Kuch Hota Hai or Dil To Pagal Hai, there is one Shah Rukh Khan who's one Archie Andrews, and there are two girls, which
Betty
is
and
Betty and
Veronica.
Veronica. So, in fact, Karan Johar himself has admitted that a lot of his bubblegum movies, where he sets up school, so the schools that he set up in Student of the Year, or for that matter, Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, or where do you see schools like that in India? But is all based on Riverdale High. The burgers they eat and the Pepsis they drink is all made to resemble Pop Tates, which is a very famous hangout of Betty and Veronica.
In fact, if you see the very latest one, Student of the Year is somewhat the same.
Exactly.
But in that case, there's one girl and two boys, and thereafter.
Yeah. So these things keep changing,
Yeah.
but the thing is, so to answer your question specifically, Archies landed on the Indian shores sometime in the 40s and 50s. And there were a lot of, there was in post-independence India, in Delhi, Bombay, there was a lot of English culture and Anglicization of culture. In AR radio, we had a radio station that was playing English songs for 3 or 4 slots of the time. So there was this very Anglicized pop culture which was very famous in India, thanks to the British and thanks to the educated Indians who went to Indian schools and who aspired to live the life of people from the West. Now, this is, I'm not making a judgment on that, but that's the reality. And there was a market for Archie's comics. There was a market for pop music. There was a market for burgers. So there were, in its own small way, now of course you see it, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
But till the 80s, till liberalization hit us, it was there in pockets. So Delhi and Mumbai had a lot of Archie's comics selling in bookstores. There were lending libraries because we couldn't afford Archie's comics. They were expensive because they were landed, imported. And so we used to go and rent them out for a week and then give it back. So that's how lending libraries used to happen. I've got a few of them right here. So a lot of that influenced people living in Delhi and Bombay and growing up in my generation, right? The Gen X generation. Karan Johar is one of them. So when he made movies, he obviously used that template. He said, hey, this is interesting. There is a lot of huge youth population. I want to use some existing templates and make those stories, and bang on, that's what you have.
So our unrealistic expectations of love and relationship
is also a lot to do with
Archies.
Archies.
A lot to do with Archies.
Yes. In fact, it's not just Karan Johar. Even before that, when movie making, when Hindi scripts started changing a bit in the 70s, you will see there is a movie called Kal Aaj Aur Kal. I'll want you to see that movie. It's a Kapoor family movie where 3 generations of Kapoors have acted, and Ranbir Kapoor, who's Kareena's father, he acts as the youngest generation. So he's like, in today's parlance, he's the Gen Z in that movie. And the clothes they wear, the parties they are conducting in the whole film set is designed after the parties that you see in the Archie's comics. So the color palette, the kind of clothes they wear.
Very retro and modern.
Very retro. And if you actually go back a little bit, in fact, I have a very strange feeling that the new Archie's film, which is going to come on Netflix, is going to be based on a movie called Umang that came sometime in the late 60s, when this whole youth culture was just, you should realize that in the 1970s, it was 25 years of Indian independence, and a generation that was born in the 40s had grown up to be Gen Zs at that point of time, right? And they were changing a lot of rules. They were asking a lot of questions, especially in urban pockets of India.
Yeah.
And a lot of movies were made for them. So if you see this movie called Umang, it talks about a gang who has formed a little club, and they dance and they party and then they do very, very Archies kind of things, and then they go through their own conflicts, etc. So that's how, pretty long-wound answer to your short question, it entered Indian pop culture, right? And you see a lot of that even today.
Good Lord, that was like a lot of insightful information. I always thought that the whole thing of dating and teenagers and these love triangles came in my generation. I'm just surprised to know that it has been happening from my parents.
From your grandparents.
From my grandparents' generation, which is just mind-blowing. It's amazing to know how comics or just movies can, influence culture so much, and
shape mindsets.
And shape mindsets, yeah. I think Archies is just one of those little tidbits that did that for us, and there are a lot more.
There are many more. I think the next time, what are we going to talk about?
I'd love to talk about Barbie, because that's something that I think I have a lot to share, just in terms of how Barbie was then and what it has become now with the new Barbie movie.
Fabulous. So
I'd
be very happy to
yeah,
join that
because I
conversation.
grew up with Barbie, so I'd love to have you, and I'd love to share my insights on how
Let's do that.
Barbie shaped cultures for women in India and around the world.
Superb. So
Yeah.
our next one is Barbie.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
everyone. I hope you really enjoyed this podcast, and if you want to know more about our insights on Barbie, stay tuned for the next one.